Before the global accolades, before the 40-piece orchestras, and before the world branded him as the Godfather of Love, there was a silence so heavy it felt like a burial. Most people remember Barry White for the velvet invitations of his voice, that deep, rumbling baritone that seemed to vibrate the very molecules of the room. But history often ignores the fact that this voice was forged in a furnace of systemic poverty, racial friction, and raw violence. To audit the life of Barry White is to examine the cold, hard architecture of a man built for war, a man who had to steal the very music that would eventually save his life. He was not a singer who stumbled into fame. He was a strategic survivor who used sound as a perimeter fence against a world that intended to redact him from existence before he reached 20. The source code of Barry White was written in Galveston, Texas, on the 12th of September 1944. He was born Barry Eugene Carter, a name that carried the weight of a fractured lineage. But the first systemic stress test of his life occurred in the concrete labyrinth of south-central Los Angeles, specifically the district of Watts. This was a geography defined by redlining and limited resources, a place where hope was a scarce commodity. His birth certificate was the first document of instability. His mother originally registered him under her family name, Carter, only for his father to later physically cross it out and replace it with White. Two names, one fractured foundation. His mother, Sadie Marie Carter, became the primary system administrator of his soul. A former actress whose dreams were terminated by chronic arthritis, she recognized that her son possessed a different operating system. She performed an act of desperate investment. She saved $50 from meager welfare checks, a massive percentage of the family's liquid assets, to buy a used upright piano. This wasn't just furniture. It was the first major component of the White infrastructure. From the age of 4, Barry didn't learn to read music. He learned to audit the frequency. He felt the vibrations of the chords, developing a specialized internal processor that bypassed formal theory for raw emotional instinct. By the time he was a teenager, he was already the organist at his local church, managing the emotional output of an entire congregation. However, by age 10, the streets demanded a different kind of data. Standing 6'3" by the time he was 14, Barry became a physical deterrent on his block. He joined gangs, the Roman 20s, and the businessmen not for the thrill, but for collective defense. He carried a reputation that kept his family safe, but the cost was his innocence. The forensic record of his crimes reveals a haunting motivation. He wasn't looking for cash or jewelry, he was stealing vinyl. He would break into houses specifically to take the records he couldn't afford to buy symphonies, jazz, and lush pop productions. Sound was his currency. Music was his extraction point from a reality that felt like a slow-motion execution. In the middle of this escalating criminal trajectory, a biological event occurred. At 14, Barry woke up and spoke, and the voice that emerged was a deep, resonating bass that literally rattled the windows of his home. It was a frequency so low it frightened him. His mother, however, recognized it as a systemic asset. She wept, telling him that her son had finally become a man. But the streets do not forgive talent. At 16, the logic errors of his lifestyle led to a total system failure. He was arrested for stealing $30,000 worth of expensive Cadillac tires and sentenced to 4 months in juvenile detention. It was in that cell, stripped of his freedom, that the final redirect command was issued. Through the prison walls, he heard the recording of Elvis Presley's "It's Now or Never." The lyrics hit him with the force of a clinical audit. He realized that his current path led to a permanent terminal state. He didn't leave juvenile hall reformed in the traditional sense. He left refocused. He realized that the same discipline required to run a gang could be applied to the manufacturing of sound. Music was no longer an escape. It was his only viable relocation strategy. He walked out of those gates with a voice that could shake the earth and a mind that was now calibrated for one thing: survival through symphony. When Barry White walked out of juvenile hall, he didn't just re-enter the world. He performed a systemic reset. He was 16 years old, already a father of 2 children, and possessed a voice that sounded like shifting tectonic plates. But in the ecosystem of south-central Los Angeles, in the early 1960 seconds, A deep voice and a criminal record were usually a one-way ticket to a permanent terminal state, either in a casket or a state penitentiary. To change his trajectory, Barry had to bypass the logic of his environment. He performed a radical act of geographic auditing. Every single day, Barry would leave the war-torn grid of Watts and walk. He didn't walk to the local corner to hang out with his former gang members. He walked toward Hollywood. It was a 15-mile journey, a grueling 3-hour trek one way under the relentless California sun. He crossed through invisible borders of race and class, moving from streets defined by gunshots and sirens to streets defined by palm trees, clean glass, and possibility. He would stand on the sidewalks of Hollywood Boulevard for hours, silent and observant, auditing a world that didn't smell like poverty or desperation. This was his visual calibration. He was feeding his internal processor with new data, reminding himself that there was a reality beyond the survival code of his neighborhood. He watched how people dressed, how they talked, and how the architecture of success was built. He was a spy in the house of the elite, taking notes on the life he intended to claim. But while he was chasing this dream, the hardware of his daily reality was still failing. He was working menial jobs, washing cars, working in warehouses, struggling to feed a family that was growing faster than his income. He began to integrate himself into the local music scene, joining vocal groups like the Upfronts, the Majestics, and the Atlantics. He was the subwoofer of these groups, providing the deep bass frequencies for local records like Little Girl on the Lumtone label. He was learning the mechanics of the recording booth, the subtle physics of how a voice hits a ribbon microphone, the social engineering required to navigate a high-pressure session, and the art of harmony. But the financial yield was negligible. He was a man with a Ferrari-grade instrument trapped in a low-rent engine. In August 1965, the systemic pressure of Los Angeles finally exploded. The Watts riots turned his neighborhood into a tactical combat zone. For 6 days, the sky was a bruised orange with the smoke of hundreds of fires. The operating system of the city had crashed. Barry watched from his doorstep as his friends and peers were redacted from history in the flames of civil unrest. Among the casualties was his close friend, singer Charles Pfizer of the Olympics, who was shot by the National Guard. The trauma of the riots issued a clear, undeniable execution command. If Barry didn't leave the streets now, the streets would liquidate him. Seeking a way out, Barry took a job as a road manager for singer Earl Nelson, also known as Jackie Lee. It was a tactical retreat from the Los Angeles war zone, but it led him directly into the hostile environment of the American South. The audit of this tour reveals the brutal cost of entry for a black man in 1,960 seconds America. In Mississippi, Barry was jailed after a confrontation with locals who viewed his mere presence, a tall, powerful black man with a deep, authoritative voice, as a provocation. In Alabama, he lived under constant surveillance. In Louisiana, he sat in a dark hotel room, watching through a crack in the curtains as men in Ku Klux Klan robes performed a ritual of intimidation in the parking lot. This was Barry's social audit of the United States. He realized that the master code of the country was designed to keep men like him in a state of permanent subservience. He returned to Los Angeles with a hardened, cold resolve. He no longer wanted to be a road manager. He no longer even wanted to be just a singer. He wanted to be the system administrator. He wanted to own the room where the decisions were made. He secured a position at Mustang Bronco Records, an independent label run by Bob Keane. Barry didn't just show up to work. He began to re-engineer the label's entire output. He worked as an A&R executive, a songwriter, and an arranger. He was the one in the booth telling the orchestra how to breathe. He was the one in the office deciding which assets were worth a contract and which were corrupted data. It was during this period that Barry encountered his first major systemic failure of the industry. He found and mentored a group called the Versatiles. He spent months perfecting their frequency, but the label executives, unable to decode the brilliance of the data Barry was presenting, passed on them. The group left, changed their name to The Fifth Dimension, and became global superstars. The loss was a clinical lesson for Barry. Trust the ear. Ignore the boardroom. He realized that the industry auditors were often blind to the very talent they were looking for. He decided then that he would never again let a middleman interfere with his vision. By 1969, Barry White had performed a systemic withdrawal from the front lines of the music industry. The collapse of Mustang Bronco Records had left him cynical but heavily armed with technical knowledge. He had seen the inner workings of the business, the broken promises, the lack of vision, and the logic errors made by executives who couldn't hear the symphony in the static. He decided the only way to win was to build his own closed-loop system. He was done chasing the approval of gatekeepers. He retreated into his home, living on the thin margins of independent production, waiting for the right hardware to manifest his vision. That hardware arrived in the form of three women: Glodian James, Linda James, and Diane Taylor. When Barry first heard them sing, the industry auditors saw just another girl group in an era already saturated with them. Barry, however, performed a spectral analysis. He didn't just hear voices. He heard a specific texture that wasn't just melodic, it was atmospheric. He renamed them Love Unlimited and began constructing a sonic environment that the world had never experienced. He didn't want them to sound like the assembly line pop of Motown. He wanted a sound that possessed massive scale. He wanted orchestras that breathed like living organisms and rhythms that operated at the frequency of a human heartbeat. The audit of the 1972 debut album, From a Girl's Point of View, We Give to You Love Unlimited, reveals the first successful deployment of the White infrastructure. Barry was not just a producer, he was a sound engineer of emotion. For the single Walking in the Rain with the One I Love, he insisted on absolute realism. He used a sound effects library to find the perfect thunderclap, and he recorded a real telephone conversation to create an unprecedented sense of voyeurism and intimacy. The arrangement was cinematic, using 40 strings to create a wall of sound that felt like a warm embrace. It went platinum, proving that Barry could manufacture intimacy on a global scale. He had successfully built the atmosphere, but the system was about to force him into a role he never wanted. The most critical systemic error occurred when Barry tried to find a male artist to lead his next series of songs. He had written a collection of tracks that were deep, gravelly, and saturated with raw vulnerability. He offered them to other singers, but the feedback was unanimous. No one could replicate the data. No one possessed the sub-bass calibration required to anchor the tracks. His business partner, Larry Nunez, issued a forced command. He told Barry that if he wanted these songs to live, he had to sing them himself. Barry's resistance was rooted in a profound body image redaction. He didn't believe a man of his size, with his history, looked like a star. He preferred the safety of the control room, but Nunez pushed, eventually funding the demo sessions out of his own pocket. In March 1973, Barry White released his debut solo album, I've Got So Much to Give. The lead single, I'm Gonna Love You Just a Little More Baby, was a disruptive technology. It was slower than the funk of the era, deeper than the soul of Motown, and it forced every other record on the radio to sound thin. It reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, and the Maestro was officially online. Later that same year, Barry performed the ultimate flex of power. He released an instrumental track titled Love's Theme under the name of the Love Unlimited Orchestra, a 40-piece ensemble he meticulously directed. The label fought him, arguing that an instrumental track with 40 strings had zero commercial viability in the era of high-energy disco and rock. Barry didn't argue. He simply let the frequency do the work. The song featured a wah-wah guitar pedal, played against a lush disco beat, and soaring strings, a combination that effectively invented the disco sound architecture. Love's Theme went to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 inches early, 1,974. It was a total market takeover. An instrumental had achieved what thousands of vocalists could not. By the end of 1,974, Barry White was the most dominant force in global music. He had 3 simultaneous revenue streams: his solo career, Love Unlimited, and the Love Unlimited Orchestra. He had transformed from a street survivor into the system administrator of love, moving from the war zone of Watts to the peak of the global charts through sheer, disciplined control of sound. By the late 1972, the global music landscape had undergone a systemic realignment. The very sound architecture Barry White had pioneered, disco, was now being commoditized and cheapened by high-tempo, low-fidelity imitations. The industry's trend auditors at 20th Century Records began to view Barry's meticulously arranged, high-cost productions as a systemic liability. They wanted shorter tracks, radio-friendly compromises, and a reduction in the orchestral scale that defined his brand. They wanted the product without the process. In a move of structural defiance, Barry performed a total exit. He walked away from his label and established his own, Unlimited Gold, in partnership with CBS in 1979. He believed that by owning the infrastructure, he could protect the atmosphere he had built. But independence in a shifting market is a high-risk gamble. The early 1980 seconds saw a consumer recalibration toward minimalist digital sounds. As his sales numbers slowed, the internal stress began to manifest. But the true crash didn't come from the market. It came from the streets he thought he had outrun. In 1982, a catastrophic system failure occurred. His younger brother, Darryl, the person Barry had fought so hard to protect from the South Central gravity, was murdered in a trivial dispute over a few dollars. For Barry, this was a psychological breach he could not repair. He had spent his life building a fortress of love and unity to protect his family, yet the streets of Watts had still managed to liquidate his own blood. The forensic record of this time shows a man who retreated into a silent, dark room. The Maestro was offline. Shortly after, his father passed away. The foundational pillars of his life were collapsing in a rapid, domino effect sequence. Simultaneously, the music industry was performing a technological overhaul. The arrival of MIDI musical, instrument digital interface, and digital synthesis meant that the 40-piece orchestra, the hardware of the white sound, was being replaced by silicon chips. Barry, the analog giant, felt like a master tailor being asked to sew with plastic thread. He integrated the technology, but the human frequency was becoming harder to maintain. The final tragic error came in 1984. Marvin Gaye reached out to Barry for a historic collaboration, a tactical merger of the two greatest voices in soul. The first session was scheduled for a Monday in early April. On Sunday, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his own father. The impact on White was a total creative blackout. He had lost his brother, his father, and now his most prestigious contemporary. The forensic record of the mid-1980 seconds shows a man in a state of hibernation. His marriage to Glodian James drifted into a permanent separation, and his health, neglected for decades under the stress of 18-hour studio days and a heavy diet used as a coping mechanism, began to show signs of mechanical decay. By 1987, the industry auditors had written him off as a legacy asset, whose time had passed, a relic of a bygone era of velvet and strings. They were wrong. His frequency was merely submerged, waiting for the digital noise of the 80 seconds to clear so the world could hear the bass again. By 1990, the music industry's trend auditors had virtually redacted Barry White from the active ledger. In the eyes of the major labels, he was categorized as a nostalgia act, a high-maintenance relic of a discarded era of velvet and strings. However, the forensic reality of music is that true frequency never actually disappears. It merely waits for the cultural noise to settle. The reboot of Barry White was not triggered by a marketing team, but by a single, high-level system request from the ultimate architect of black music, Quincy Jones. Jones, who was producing his seminal Back on the Block project, understood that the new generation of R&B stars, Al B., sure, James Ingram, and El DeBarge, while talented, lacked the foundational sub-bass required to anchor a truly timeless record. He needed a sonic bedrock, a voice that carried the weight of history. He invited Barry to perform on a track titled The Secret Garden. When Barry's voice entered the mix, it acted as a systemic grounding. It provided a gravity that the digital, treble-heavy 1980 seconds had lacked. The song went to #1 on the R&B charts, and suddenly, a generation of listeners who had grown up on synthesized pop discovered the Maestro frequency for the first time. Barry White recognized this as his market re-entry point. He performed a total image calibration, emerging with a sharpened look, a sleek ponytail, and a tailored wardrobe, signaling that he was no longer a ghost of the disco past, but a modern, sophisticated icon. He signed with A&M Records, but the internal risk assessment at the label remained skeptical. They doubted that a 50-year-old baritone could compete with the high-energy New Jack Swing and the emerging hip-hop dominance of the mid-90 seconds. They viewed his return as a legacy play rather than a competitive threat. They were wrong. In 1994, he released the album that would complete his industrial resurrection, The Icon Is Love. The production was a masterclass in infrastructure hybridization. He blended his classic live string arrangements with modern hip-hop-influenced drum programming. He didn't imitate the new generation. He taught them how to execute intimacy with technical precision. The lead single, Practice What You Preach, didn't just climb the charts. It performed a total market takeover. It stayed at #1 on the R&B charts for 3 weeks and crossed over to become a massive top 20 pop hit. Barry had successfully performed a legacy patch, proving that his atmospheric architecture was not a trend, but a permanent human requirement. The album went double platinum, selling over 2 million units and reminding the industry that the owner of the atmosphere had returned to reclaim his title. This period was characterized by a massive influx of new data. A younger audience was now downloading the white philosophy. However, the forensic audit of this period reveals a tragic resource drain. While his career was at a new peak performance, his biological hardware was in a state of terminal decay. For decades, Barry had operated under a survival logic that prioritized the output of the machine over the maintenance of the operator. He continued to work 18-hour days, consumed a high-stress diet, and smoked up to 4 packs of cigarettes a day, habits forged in the anxiety of his Watts youth. He possessed a profound doctor avoidance protocol, a common trait among those who came from poverty, preferring to ignore the warning signals of his body to keep the symphony running. By the late 90 seconds, the system logs showed critical errors, chronic hypertension, and escalating kidney disease. Yet, in 1999, he released his final studio album, Staying Power. The title was more than a song, it was a clinical statement of fact. At the 42nd Grammy Awards in 2000, the institutional auditors finally corrected a 25-year-old oversight. Barry White won his first 2 Grammys, Best Male R&B Vocal Performance and Best Traditional R&B Vocal Performance. It was the final systemic validation. After decades of being relegated to a separate room of pop music, the industry finally admitted that the Maestro was the primary administrator of the soul. But the biological breach was now beyond repair. The body could no longer keep pace with the sound it had carried for a lifetime. In September 2002, the body finally forced a total system shutdown. Barry suffered a massive stroke that impaired his speech and limited his movement. For a man whose life was defined by absolute control over orchestras, over business, and over emotion, this was the ultimate logic error. The voice that had moved millions and generated billions for the industry was suddenly silenced. On the 4th of July, 2003, while America celebrated its independence with fireworks and noise, Barry White died from kidney failure and cardiac arrest at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He was 58 years old. The timing was symbolic. Explosions in the sky, while a deep silence settled where a giant once stood. The physical redaction of the man was complete, but his residual frequency was only just beginning to expand. The physical redaction of Barry White on the 4th of July, 2003, did not result in a systemic shutdown. In the world of forensic musicology, the death of a creator is often the moment where their residual frequency begins its true global expansion. While the biological hardware failed, the atmospheric architecture he constructed proved to be indestructible. To audit the legacy of Barry White is to realize that he didn't just leave behind a catalog of hits. He left behind a universal operating system for intimacy, dignity, and sound that continues to function across every digital and analog platform today. The forensic data of the post-2003 era reveals a staggering level of asset integration within modern culture. Barry White remains one of the most sampled artists in the history of recorded music. His strings, his bass lines, and the specific texture of his arrangements have been surgically extracted by hip-hop's elite producers from Dr. Dre and the RZA to Kanye West and Kendrick Lamar to provide the grounding frequency for the hits of the 21st century. When a modern producer needs to inject weight or historical authority into a track, they return to the White archive. He is the invisible backbone of the modern urban sound, a ghost in the MPC providing soul for the Silicon Age. But his influence extends far beyond the technicality of a sample. Barry White performed a cultural recalibration of masculinity that has yet to be replicated. He proved that a man from the most violent streets of Los Angeles, a man who had seen the inside of a jail cell and the barrel of a gun, could project a power based on gentleness and stillness rather than outward aggression. He taught a generation of men that the deepest frequency isn't the one that screams, but the one that vibrates with enough confidence to wait for the world to listen. He replaced the hypermachismo of the streets with a maestro authority, a code of conduct that prioritized discipline, elegance, and emotional intelligence over raw, unrefined force. In the final audit, we look at the biological legacy. Despite the inevitable legal frictions and estate disputes that followed the death of a titan, the primary data remains unchanged. Barry White sold over 100 million records worldwide. He received 106 gold and 41 platinum albums, along with 20 gold and 10 platinum singles. But his most impressive statistic is one that cannot be measured by RIAA certifications, the atmospheric requirement he provided for human connection. It has been a long-standing industry joke that Barry White was responsible for a global population spike. While humorous, the forensic truth is that his music manufactured the safety required for vulnerability in an increasingly disconnected world. He was the only artist who could make a 40-piece orchestra sound as intimate as a whisper in a dark room. As the files of this audit are placed into the permanent archive, the conclusion is clear. Barry White was never just a singer, and he was never just a sex symbol. He was a tactical visionary who outran a lethal destiny by building a fortress of sound. He took the now or never command he heard in a prison cell and turned it into an eternal always. The maestro has left the building, but the atmosphere he created is still breathing. Every time a bass line rattles a window, every time a string section swells in a quiet room, or every time a voice drops an octave to speak a truth that matters, the source code of Barry White is active. He proved that you don't need to read music to write the future. You only need to be deep enough to hold the weight of the world. As the digital files of this audit are placed into the permanent cultural archive, we must address the final, most profound element of the Barry White system, the architecture of the void. In an industry that rewards speed, noise, and constant movement, Barry White's most radical contribution was his mastery of the negative space. He understood that the weight of a voice is not measured by its volume, but by the silence it commands. His legacy is not a collection of songs. It is a blueprint for how a human being can maintain dignity, authority, and intimacy in a world designed to fragment and distract us. The forensic conclusion of his life reveals a man who successfully performed a systemic extraction. He took the raw materials of his environment, the hunger of Watts, the violence of the streets, and the systemic racism of America, and processed them into a frequency that felt like security. He realized early on that chaos dominates spaces that move too fast. Therefore, his entire artistic career was a campaign of deliberate deceleration. He slowed down the tempo of soul music until it matched the resting pulse of a human being at peace. He wasn't just providing a mood, he was recalibrating the internal clock of his listeners. This is the reason why his music resists the depreciation that affects so many of his peers. While many stars of the 70 seconds and 80 seconds were version-specific, meaning their sound was tied to the technology and trends of a specific year, Barry White's sound was universal firmware. It does not age because it is built on the most fundamental human hardware, the heartbeat and the breath. Whether it is played on a 1,974 turntable or streamed on a 2026 digital interface, the effect is identical. He created a buffer zone against the world, a space where time feels non-linear and where vulnerability is protected by a wall of strings. But the final audit must also acknowledge the human cost of this architecture. Barry White was a man who became a prisoner of his own creation. The maestro was a persona built for survival, a shield of velvet and gold that eventually became too heavy for the man beneath it to carry. He spent his life ensuring everyone else felt safe and loved, while he himself struggled with the isolation of the control room. He was a man who gave the world the soundtrack to intimacy, but lived much of his final years in a state of professional and personal seclusion. However, the data persistence of his work is undeniable. Barry White proved that you do not need to read music to write the future. You only need to be deep enough to hold the weight of the world. He taught us that stillness is power. He showed us that a man can be powerful without being aggressive, and that love can be a discipline of steel rather than a sentiment of glass. The maestro has left the building, and the biological machine has ceased to function, but the atmosphere remains online. Every time a bass line vibrates a floorboard, every time a string section swells to fill a quiet room, and every time a voice drops an octave to speak a truth that matters, the source code of Barry White is active. He didn't just sing for us. He built a room for us to stay in, and in that room, the frequency of love is the only law.